Hey friends, it's Mr. Rogers here, and I want to talk about cell theory and the scientists that help create the cell theory. And it's kind of like a pre kind of cell lesson. I mean, we're not going to talk a lot about cells today, but the idea here is I would like you guys to know the history behind how we came from knowing what a cell is to what we know about a cell today. So on Friday, you guys watched the video. It was pretty crazy watching what an inside of a cell kind of looks like, and how we kind of got there and how we think about cells. So the first big thing here is, if I actually back up, sorry, can I explain what life is cellular means? So life itself, obviously, we talked about what a living thing needs to have to be living, and one of the big things was to have cells. And so we call life as cellular because every living thing we've ever encountered has cells. And so this idea is a big part of why we study cells so much. Because if we understand what cells are, we have an understanding of what life is. Now, it all started with Robert Hooke. Now, Robert Hooke is a fascinating guy. And I really don't know how to explain him to my best of my abilities over a Google Meet, but I'll try my best. So he is known to study hundreds of things. He studied thousands of different things, and he was the head of the science wing in England at the time. And one of the big things he studied was something called cytology, the study of cells. And so he was one of the first people to get a microscope, and he was the first one to look through, and he was looking at dead cork cells. Cork comes from a tree, natural cork does. And he was looking at these trees, and he saw these little cells, kind of like this. This is what it looked like underneath his microscope. And he called them cells because it kind of looked like the little rooms at that point that were in monasteries that monks lived in, or like jail cells, another way to think about it, okay? Like little tiny rooms, and that's why we call them cells today still. Now, why I said Hooke is a really hard man to understand. This is actually not a real picture of Hooke. This is kind of a guess of maybe what he looked like. Hooke was a man that was not afraid to anger people, and his biggest fight was against Isaac Newton. And Isaac Newton is obviously a name that you've probably heard of before, and you've probably not heard of Robert Hooke. And there's a lot to that, because after Robert Hooke died, Isaac Newton took all of Robert Hooke's readings, all of his books, all of his paintings from the England Science Foundation, and all the stuff that was hanging up on the wall, and buried it or burnt them. And so we lost a lot of Robert Hooke's things, even though he's one of the most important scientists of the time. Because of his battle with Isaac Newton, he is kind of not forgotten, obviously, because I'm talking about him now, but not nearly as famous as he probably should be. All because he was in a spat with Isaac Newton. It's kind of an interesting story. This is what people thought he kind of looked like, which is interesting in itself too, because Isaac Newton wrote in his diary that Robert Hooke was the ugliest man he's ever met, and Isaac Newton was not the only person to ever put that. So it's just interesting that, I mean, that's not the ugliest man I ever met. I don't know. It's interesting. Robert Hooke's an interesting guy. If you ever want to read about somebody, he's worth a read, at least worth a Wikipedia page read. And so we have Hooke. He found what cells are. The real guy that actually finally saw like a living thing moving underneath the cell was a guy named Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He took pond water and took a look underneath the microscope. He's also famous for taking teeth scrapings, the plaque off teeth, and looking at them. And he was the first one to actually see something living underneath the microscope. And because he saw this, we still remember him. So he's the first one to actually see this. And what he was seeing were these things. And these things exist in fresh water in Kalkaska too. If we took some pond water, we would see these things. So the top left is paramecium. They're kind of like the wolves or the lions of fresh water. They eat a bunch of things. We have euglena, which is kind of like a plant type kind of protist that moves around and tries to get sunlight. Rotifers that connect to stones and try to grab things out of the water. Same with stentors, and amoebas slowly ooze around. Vorticellas kind of look like the attacking flower in Mario. You kind of see like here's a little spring and here's like a little flower part. And then we have some bacteria that he saw too, the different types. Spirilla means it's a spiral. bacilla means it's a rod, and coxy means it's a circle. So where we're actually getting to today is this idea of why we actually come up with a cell theory. Now, what a cell theory is it's saying that all living things are made up of cells. This is a theory. This is an idea, and we'll talk about why a little bit tomorrow, why things are considered theories and not just like laws. Like none of you guys are considering the cells being non-existent. Some of you guys have seen cells in microscopes. Some of you guys haven't. Yeah, that's fine, but you guys know things have cells. And so these three guys played a huge role. So Matthias Schleiden in 1838, this was like 150, 175 years after Robert Hooke and Leland Hooke here. He concluded that all plants are made up of cells. He was looking at a bunch of plants and he kept seeing the same kind of cells over and over and over and over again. And he made that decision and made that finding that all plants are made up of cells. A year later, using the data from Schleiden, Theodor Schwann did the same thing. He looked at a bunch of animals and he saw that they were always made up of cells. And so he concluded that all animals are made up of cells. And then Rudolf Virchow in 1858, this seems like a very obvious thing, but it was not for a very long time for many different reasons. He said that all cells come from other cells. And what it means by that is at that point they thought, well, if bacteria was growing on meat or something like that, that it could just randomly appear. Things don't just randomly appear. Living things come from other living things. And so cells have to come from other cells. Humans come from other humans. Therefore, so same with bacteria, cells, everything else. And so that's what Rudolf Virchow talked about. So we took all these ideas and we came up with a cell theory, and it's 3 statements. And we have to memorize these 3 statements. It's all living things are composed of cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function of living things. And new cells are produced from existing cells. So starting from the top, all living things are composed of cells. We already knew this. We talked about this in the 7 characteristics of living things. All living things have cells. Second one, cells are the basic units of structure and function of living things. So to be a living thing, you at least have to have one cell. You can't have something smaller than a cell and be considered living. It's the smallest basic unit of structure and function of living things. If it's not the right way of describing it, but it's a good way of thinking about it, cells are basically like the monomers of living things. We talked about those the last couple of weeks. Monomers are one unit, and we connect a bunch of cells together, we get a bigger unit, a bigger thing, a polymer. So cells are the most basic unit of structure and function of living things. It's the smallest one thing something could be and be considered living. And then new cells are produced from existing cells. Like I said, to make a new cell, it has to come from an existing cell, which always gets some questions in class. And somebody's going to ask me, and you may be thinking about it, well, to have cells come from existing cells, you have to start somewhere. What did the first cell come off of? And that's a question that everyone's still trying to answer. But right now, this is the cell theory. These 3 things we have to know. These are 3 things that qualify something as a cell, and it qualifies something as living. So the other thing real quick, we're going to talk about it in class really briefly. We already talked about this earlier this month, but remember prokaryotes and eukaryotes? Remember that prokaryotes are something that they have DNA in cell walls, cytoplasm, ribosomes, but they do not have a nucleus. They do not have membrane-bound organelles. Examples, bacteria. Eukaryotes, they do have a nucleus. They have other organelles. Examples are plant cells and animal cells. So just trying to get you to remember that. We're going to come back to that tomorrow a little bit. So hopefully the notes weren't that bad. You followed along with the fill in the blank. If you have any questions, let me know. Thanks, guys.